Well, I think I am. Hi there, welcome. I'm Bob Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you to the Philanthropic Planner program. We talk about an exciting, no, it's boring, a boring subject of philanthropy. So we've been doing this, I'm told by Karen, more than 11 years now, talking about the significance of philanthropy to the local community, to the state, region, country, and the world. And we try to take a friendly forum for meaningful dialogue and talk about this goofy subject. And I sometimes get carried away, and I have props that make me look even dumber than dumb. But we have fun, and philanthropy should be fun because there's a karma of if I give, I get something back. And we've got a lot of examples of that in this season. If you don't notice, it was very cold this morning. I went down for the paper and it was like 2 degrees with a chill factor of -11 or something. So we're in this time of giving seasonally. A good example of that was I went to Fitzgerald's for groceries, and here's a family, husband and wife and 2 children, ringing the Salvation Army bells. Family, giving back, philanthropy, examples of family value, and I can guarantee you, there are no guarantees, but I say there's a high probability that these 2 young children will be mindful of giving back. A chronicle, and I usually start with the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and this one's kind of messed up because I had it on the plane in my briefcase, and I kept taking it out, trying to stay awake and reading about philanthropy on my way down to Florida, which was a little bit warmer than it was this morning. But 2 issues ago, I think back in September, the Chronicle's cover was, I live here, I give here. So philanthropy, as we know it, and as I've known it and experienced it over a number of years, is giving back to the community and so on. But we want to talk about philanthropy in a different way. But there are a lot of publications. Giving Tomorrow is one, and perhaps I could use this, the first 5 or 10 seconds of programs. Planned Giving Insider is for development people with charities and so on. So there's a lot being written about philanthropy. But something that I've noticed, and I've mentioned this last few programs, we talk about local giving. We talk about giving back. There are a lot of ways of giving and being a philanthropist. One is by volunteering, and the other is by contributing dollars and assets. But Healing Meals, a program locally in feeding, providing meals and so on, over 40,000 provided in the last couple of years by Healing Meals. We had at our last program, Nancy Sheets was nice enough to join us with the Farmington Valley of V&A and talking about serving the community in many ways that they do. And people that have watched either one of the programs that we produce, College Funding or Philanthropic Planner, know that I struggle with titles. And as we put together some thoughts about do away with the props and this kind of thing, but what's the message we want to get across? Well, this particular one is the result of a mixed bag, and I'll explain that in a second, but a lot of mixed signals today in the philanthropic world, and I end up putting those together from various articles in these publications, and Our title today, good or bad, Baby Boomers Stories Continue. My favorite subject over the last years about how the baby boomer wave contributed in the 80s, 90s, single digits and so on. But we're revisiting the baby boomers, this 80 million people in that generation, and we're kind of focusing in on their stories. Baby boomers' stories continue, and their philanthropy. So kind of crazy when we look at this, because we have heard over the years of this intergenerational wealth transfer that's going to take place and is presently taking place. And back when, at one of our national conventions of philanthropic planners, Paul Shervish up in Boston said, this intergenerational wealth transfer is going to be like $23 trillion. And this was like 20 years ago. Well, now, recently we were talking about $47 trillion. And someone comes up, and I don't know if it's Shervish or not, but talking about 55 or 60 trillion dollars of intergenerational wealth. I would think that those last figures might be reasonable, simply because the growth of our economy, the growth of assets, has certainly been outstanding since the banking crisis back in 2008, 2009. So we certainly have grown in the trillions. So that 50, 55, 60 trillion dollar figure may not be far off. But mixed bag. We're also in a political campaign season, and we have some candidates that are talking about inequality and a wealth tax, and how we're going to have the super ultra rich people solve a lot of our problems by taxing them. One candidate talks about a percentage wealth tax of not income, but of assets. And that if we tax 2% of your wealth every year, then that will create enough revenue for the government to provide benefits and entitlements and so on. Another example of wealth tax, and I may be the same political candidate, is that we tax upwards of 80% of income over certain income levels. Another candidate, not to be outdone, says that figure we can tax 90% of their income. So we're taxing assets, we're taxing income if these things have fruition. Where does that stand as far as the nonprofits are concerned? Well, we have these philanthropic publications and everything that are enjoying their endowments growing. They're enjoying the success of the stock market and so on. Again, I point to point, one of the points that we start with and we compare is that banking crisis in 2008 and 2009. Certainly we have done well since then as far as the market is concerned. Now, what does that mean as far as accumulating wealth on paper, certainly, with the baby boomers? How did the baby boomers come into play here with the increase in wealth? How does that reflect, or how is it reflected on donors and donations to nonprofits and so on? Well, the baby boomers, typical, are unique in a lot of ways, and their giving has changed, or their giving is different than, let's say, the Rockefellers and Carnegies and so on. certainly that's not a surprise, and we shouldn't be surprised there. But a lot of wealth, and I'm saying super wealth, if we talk about Gates, Family Foundation, and so on, and Warren Buffett, a couple years ago, saying Warren Buffett will gift to the Gates Foundation, and so on. We're talking about a lot of wealth. So going back to this taxing assets or taxing income or both or whatever, we talk about these very, very large private foundations. Just recently, I saw an article on the Lilly Foundation has passed, and they've gone to number 2, but they passed the previous number 2, the Ford Foundation. Well, your top 5 are certainly Gates. Now you have Lilly at number 2, Ford number 3. You have the Robert Johnson probably in 4 or 5. You have Hewitt certainly up there in that area. Okay. When we talk about the billions and billions and billions of dollars of these private foundations, I've alluded to the fact that there has been, in effect, regulation that 5% of the private foundation monies, assets, be paid out in some grant form to charities. That's been around for a while, and we got through this little hump in the road with respect to how some private foundations were having their administrative costs be a part of the 5%. And then we look today and say, along with some potential new tax laws or regulations or whatever, we look at governance, we look at the management, we look at the investment of the endowments and so on, and say, how can we improve the situation? Well, we have examples, and more than what I think we should have, as far as the donor or the donor's family member being in administrative position, management of the endowment, the private foundation, and receiving compensation. And there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly going back to the family and the family values and so on, and there needs to be administration and management. There's nothing wrong with the family member being in there. But we, in looking at reasonable comp as being a factor, there are examples where I'd have to be the CEO of a major corporation to mirror over here the foundation family members' relative comp. So there are things that we need to look at. And when we talk about baby boomers, the baby boomers are the ones that are contributing certainly on an annual basis to charities. And that figure is in the high 300 billion, 400 billion. People are saying annual contributions to nonprofits. Well, baby boomers have changed the turf a little bit, where they want to know the impact of their donation, their gift, and that's a little bit different than back when we thought that private foundation was going to do good, generally speaking, to the needy concerns, okay, for the social good. And that was assumed that that private foundation was geared to that need. Gates Foundation, for example, a lot of their grants, I would say big majority of their grants, is dedicated to education. And part of that is the reason that Warren Buffett said, I'll contribute 40 billion to your program. So we have these baby boomers saying, I want to have more control. I want to have more control. So impact giving is one of being different than my gifting 10,000 or 100,000 or whatever in an unrestricted gift to the charity, an unrestricted gift to the university or the hospital or whatever. That has changed a noticeable degree by the boomer wanting to know more about the impact and maybe making that contribution and having a restricted provision in there for a specific goal of the donor. That's a little bit different than the history of development staff, professional development people, and a lot of the major gifts being unrestricted. Well, the significance of unrestricted is that those monies can be and are used for general administration of the charity. But the baby boomer is a little bit different in that respect on impact investing. Now let's move for a second from the private foundations that we were talking about to the foundations of universities, of charities, large charities, and let's look at community foundations as well. A recent article in the Philanthropic, the Chronicle, or some other publications talked about $1 trillion in community foundation assets. Now it's taken me years and years, and I still don't understand maybe the significance of $1 billion, but now today we talk about trillion. How do you get your arms around $1 trillion of assets? Silicon Valley Community Foundation, funded, so you would expect, by high-tech companies and their owners and founders and a lot of their upper management income. But Silicon Valley Community Foundation is the largest, with over $14 billion. Now, again, going to market, and a lot of these foundations, and I guess we could make another example of Lilly. Lilly Foundation is largely, almost exclusively funded by Lilly stock. So the same Silicon Valley Community Foundation, they reach this plateau here and 14 billion, and all of a sudden they lose $4 billion. And a lot of the reason is it's subject to that underlying funding of the company stock of the founder, let's say. So that kind of leads us into some other concerns that charities have today. They've experienced a good market, as I said, and with that market comes more donor gifts, because maybe they're looking at the appreciation of some stock, high appreciation, and if they are well advised, in my opinion, rather than cash, gifting of cash, certainly looking at the appreciated stock or what have you, and the asset, and gifting that and saying, wow, if we, after 10, 11 years of bull market, we are, and a lot of pundits out there are saying, we're due and have been due for a correction, maybe a good sized recession. Well, 2018 was not a great year in the market, and you had a lot of these university endowments and a lot of charity endowments and private foundations and community foundations and so on. 2018 was not a great net year for some of these funds. Minus 4%, even minus 5% would be the norm or the average. So a lot of that was due to the fourth quarter of 2018 having a correction of 18.8%, which is pretty heavy. The fourth quarter made a pretty tough year, that fourth quarter. And that was on top of February, another correction of 11.4. So you had two quarters that were good in the year and two that you had some major pullback and correction there. So nonprofits are looking today at the probability, the nature of the market and investments, that we will have a correction, another correction, or several, or a recession, in fact. And then we have, as we always have, periodic elections. And we're coming up this coming year to major political effect. I will say that if we look at volatility as these investment managers for foundations and endowments, we look at that increased volatility perhaps in a presidential election year. You know, how does that affect our grant making? Well, let's come back to some of the proposed policies and say it's one thing to tax the wealthy's income. It's one thing to tax the assets of the ultra wealthy. But how about taxing endowments that are huge? Yale endowment, Harvard endowment, they're in the high 30s, maybe even $40 billion. Now, if I had the added regulation or what have you of a 5% payout of my assets, similar to a private foundation. Well, in 2017, there was an act, a lot of people weren't aware of this, that taxing the very, very, very large endowments like Harvard, and that was tied to $500,000 of your endowment per student. Well, where there's a regulation, there are ways to get around those, I guess. Some very shrewd advisors and so on. But is that a direction that we're going in? And some of this is by the influence of successful, wealthy baby boomers. So we look at the continuing stories of the baby boomer, and we look at their philanthropy. And when I go back to the very beginning of this being a mixed bag, it is because of that. Now, let's talk about the baby boomer individually and how that has changed in addition to impact giving. We look at the generation of the baby boomers, 80 million. And as we got through the ages of how we define the baby boomers, and we find what was the family dynamic, marrying later than their parents, an increase in divorce, but this is purportedly the healthiest generation, the 80 million. So we're living longer, but at the same time, you have the gray divorce. I never heard of it when I was in law school, but the gray divorce is the divorce after 20, 25, 30 years of marriage, and at ages 55 or 60 or something like getting divorced. Then the ramifications of that are blended families, his and hers and ours and that kind of thing, and multiple divorces, the same people. But how does that affect giving? We have an incredibly large increase in donor advised funds. Now, the baby boomers early on were exposed to the 1969 Act that focused in on charitable giving vehicles. And the charitable remainder trust vehicle was very, very popular in the 70s and early 80s. But expensive vehicles, and you had to have the math work for you as far as the size of the contribution to the charitable remainder trust and the different kinds. There are a number of different kinds of charitable trusts. But administrative costs became an issue. The income to the donor, the split interest trust, the income to the donor first and then the remainder interest going to charity. So what we have today is this incredible growth in donor advised funds. And, we talk about the Fidelity Charitable Fund and the Schwab Charitable Fund and so on. And we have the community foundations coming along, offering, if you will, the donor advised project accounts. So the baby boomer influence there, I think, is noted. We have changes in planning, estate planning, because of the blended families. We have different strategies. I can have a charitable, a qualified charitable deduction, a direct distribution, I should say. And we do that out of these assets that we've accumulated at an age 70 and a half, take advantage of the qualified charitable distribution. Now, that's after 70 and a half, but leading up to 70 and a half, we've got these great opportunities, like I say, of the donor advised fund for tax purposes. Now, a big portion of the baby boomers now, fewer and fewer are itemizing. So again, advisors will, to a large extent, offer a strategy of a donor advised fund to offset this loss of itemizing, tax savings wise. So things in the future, we see that the stretch IRA with the CARE Act that I think is going to be passed in some form or another, but stretch IRAs are going to go by the wayside, but it's going to create opportunities for the wealthy and focusing on Q-tip trusts and ERISA benefit plans, and how we address not only the tax savings but the philanthropic need out there. So baby boomers, we reluctantly go back and revisit. We talk about the changes in our society and how the baby boomers bought this kind of a car and had this kind of diamond and so on and so on and on and on. But the baby boomers certainly have had an impact, and they will continue to have an impact on the intergenerational wealth transfer that we talk about. Thanks for coming in. Appreciated sharing with you. See you next time.